first time in Vilnius. Thank you so much for the invitation. In studies conducted by consulting firms, around 90% of leaders indicate that they want their organization to be agile. That's a high number. Why may this be the case? Well, I think most leaders today are thinking about the fact that they have an uncertain business environment around them. New competitors may be arriving. Customers may be more demanding, may have higher expectations. There might be new rules and regulations that you have to adapt to. On the other hand, when asked whether they currently see their firms as highly agile, the result is the opposite, with only about 10% stating that their firms currently is highly agile. So there is a big gap here. On the one hand, we see the need for agility or flexibility and adaptability. On the other hand, we are concerned about the fact that our organizations are not flexible enough, not fast enough. Things are moving too slowly. So today, the word agile is used as a synonym for flexibility at all levels of an organization. However, the origin of the word is in software development. And it started with an agile manifesto written by a group of software developers in 2001. And it was basically a kind of protest against the dominant software development approach used at the time, the so-called waterfall method, where you spent a lot of time in detailed planning before you started programming. You had a very specific budget. You had a lot of need for documentation, structured methods, and so on. So they wanted something different. Today, in software development, we associate agile with mainly three things. The first one is speed. So the idea is to work in so-called sprints that can be 2-week development periods, and you're supposed to have a workable solution after the 2 weeks. The second element is to use small teams, often cross-functional teams with different kinds of experts. And the idea is that these teams work iteratively. So instead of developing one big solution, they try to release small things early and often, rather than producing one big product. And the third element is early customer involvement. Sometimes the customer may even be present on the site in the same building. If that's not possible, at least one tries to get frequent customer feedback on the releases that are being produced quite frequently, as I mentioned. We might want to add a fourth element to this, which is face-to-face communication. They mentioned in their manifesto that they prefer face-to-face communication in teams rather than using plans, procedures, and formal documentation to coordinate their work. A metaphor that is sometimes used to explain Agile is mountaineering and alpine climbing techniques. If we go back to the 1950s, the typical Mount Everest expedition had at least dozens, sometimes hundreds of climbers, as well as Sherpas that carried the gear up to the base camp and then further up to the various camps until you reach the mountain, the summit. But a revolution happened during the late 1970s when people in Switzerland started thinking about using alpine climbing techniques in Himalaya. The most famous one of them all is Reinhold Messner. So instead of having hundreds of people, he climbed Mount Everest in 1978 alone with a colleague, and he was the first who didn't use oxygen. And 2 years later, he went solo up to the summit. So one person could achieve the same as 400 people in the 1950s. Now, this is an extreme example, but I actually looked up in the database of Mount Everest climbing, and the average team size used to be 35, and today it's 5. So there's an enormous difference because of the introduction of these climbing techniques. So the idea here is that being fewer people, having less gear, you can move more quickly up to the different camps. And this is not only less costly, but it's also more flexible. So think about the planning horizon for a big team in the 1950s. They spent typically months planning the ascent, and they needed several weeks of good weather in order to reach the summit. Now, Reinhold Messner, he's very quick, he's very well trained, so he can go up in a few days. So the difference is the ability to adapt to the natural uncertainty in the environment, such as the weather. These guys needed several weeks of good weather to reach the summit. Reinhold Messner, he only needs a few days, and similar with other small climbing teams. This is fairly similar to the goals that leaders tell me that they are pursuing. So for example, a few weeks ago I had a meeting with a small oil company in Norway, where I live. And this company is challenging the big oil companies in the North Sea. And they told me that today it takes about 11 years from you have a plan to produce oil until you actually have an oil rig out in the field and are producing oil. And they said, we want to reduce it from 11 years to 6 years. And they also told me that today it costs $12 per barrel to extract the oil. They say, we don't believe that's sustainable. We want to use $7 per barrel. So with these kinds of goals, you need to work in a different manner. You need to organize your operations in a different manner. You need to be like an alpine climber in Himalaya. Now, the question I was asked, however, was not how we can organize a flexible team. The question was how we can design a flexible organization, which is a bit different. So the question I would like to discuss with you here is whether we can scale up these agile principles to the organizational level. And because I have little time, I will give you my conclusion already. So in my opinion, Agile is a great source of inspiration, and I definitely believe that many companies need to become more flexible. However, it's an incomplete model. It's not sustainable alone unless you combine it with some other features. Let me explain to you my thinking on this. Unfortunately, what has happened with Agile is that it has become a fad. So it's being sold as a universal solution, no matter what problem you have in your company. And the other problem is that it's also a bit unclear now what it means. It was clear, I think, when we talked about software development. Today, when you're using it about just about everything, it becomes less clear. As pointed out by Bob Sutton, a professor at Stanford, who interviewed 50 leaders and consultants and found out that each person basically had his or her own definition. And he used this drawing to illustrate this. These are 40 agile methods, everything from extreme manufacturing to Scrum to holacracy to lean and so on. So just about everything now is categorized as agile, and that makes it very hard to discuss. There's another challenge, and that is that I have discovered that the people who should know Agile the best, the IT people, they are actually starting to have some doubts about it. I came across this study among 150 CIOs, so Chief Information Officers in UK and US companies. Almost all of them said that they used agile methods in their organization. I think it was 96%. But 34% also said that they also said that 34% of their agile projects were partly or complete failures. So now we don't know the failure rate of traditional IT projects. That might be even higher. So we don't have a comparison, but at least these data suggest that it's not the perfect method. And this is also illustrated in another question that was asked, where the respondents indicated that Agile has been discredited. More than half said that Agile now has been discredited. So they're not actually believers anymore in this method, which I think is important to note. So how can we understand this? I mean, all over the world, people are implementing Agile, but those who gave us this method are starting to have doubts. Well, I think the main issue is that it was intended as a team-level approach. If you read the Agile Manifesto, which you can download from the internet, it talks about the team all the time. So they are assuming that we have one team working on one product at one point in time. However, that's not the reality in most firms that I know. In most firms, this is the reality. You have at least 3, you might have dozens, hundreds of teams, and they have interdependencies between them. So in a car manufacturing company, one team is developing the engine, another is developing the brakes, a third is developing the car body or chassis, and they need to fit together. So you need to coordinate in a systematic fashion. And that's not something that they talk much about in the Agile approach. I have 3 proposals for how we can handle this without necessarily rejecting Agile, but treating it in a slightly different way. One is that I don't think you should start with an Agile conviction. That's the solution. That's the treatment. So we have to know what the affliction is that we're supposed to treat. This means that we have to do an assessment of the organization, or what I called an organizational diagnosis. We have to find out where the problem is. Where do we need the flexibility? Is it at all levels, in all units, or is it mainly in the customer-facing units or in product development? We have to involve people in collecting data so that we know what the problem is. And by the way, I think that you as HR people are well positioned here. I think you should have the tools and methods so you can help leaders make these kinds of organizational assessments, and then you can think about what the solution is when you know what the challenge is. My second proposal is that decentralization is good, but it's not everything. So a key assumption in the Agile approach is that you need to have autonomous teams who are empowered to make decisions about their own work. And that's good, and there are several studies that show that decentralization helps speed and flexibility when the environment is changing. And it's easy to understand why, because in a very centralized organization, you always have to ask for approval for changes from top management. In a decentralized organization, the local units can make decisions themselves and don't need to wait for managers higher up to approve what they're doing. So that's good. However, it needs to be balanced with central coordination in some areas. What this means is that we need a set of processes, tools, and roles to help us coordinate across different teams and projects. So if it's an IT-intensive firm, one key role would be an IT architect that handles decisions that affect multiple teams and ensures that everybody's working from the same standards, and that the product actually is coherent and that things fit together. And the IT architect will need to use a minimum of methods and documentation to get this done. And these are un-agile methods, but I think they are necessary if you want to scale this up to the organizational level. The third proposal I have is to look at the overall organizational structure, which also affects your flexibility. One alternative is the multidimensional structure proposed by the late US professor Russell Ackoff. So his starting point was that we have to ask ourselves, which functions do we need to perform as an organization? And he concluded there are three main functions. First is that we need to market and sell our products. Well, then we need some organizational units that have this responsibility. If you have a business segment and a consumer segment, you might need two boxes. It may be Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, a regional structure, but some units that have the responsibility to market and sell the products to the customers. Then we have another function, which is to develop and deliver products. So we need some units to do that. This could be software, hardware, it can be cars and trucks, it can be insurance and loans if it's a bank, and so on and so forth. Finally, we need to help these units. We need to have internal support functions, operations, IT, HR, finance, and so on. So this gives us a three-dimensional organizational model. Why may this be a flexible organization? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that you could have different combinations or configurations. So the first product can be sold to both of these segments, and all of the internal service support units can help out all of the product and market units in such a structure. So you can have a customer-specific value chain depending on what you are delivering. But secondly, instead of having a large business unit, ACOF also proposed that most of the employees should be located here in a people unit. So if you have a resource pool with people and lend the people out, almost like internal consultants, to these units, you can scale these units up and down depending on need. So you get a lot of scalability in this model. And if these units are small, they can also more easily be added or removed depending on the market circumstances. By the way, this is not a matrix organization. Every manager only has one boss, and you have internal customer-supply relationships rather than reporting relationships inside this structure. Now, there are pros and cons with this model as any other organizational model. And in my book, I go through this in much more detail than I can do here. So the point is not to sell this particular model. My point is that we have to consider the organizational level if we want to have a flexible organization. We have to consider the overall architecture of the firm. And the second point is that in the Agile approach, one seems to equate flexibility with informality. So instead of having formal documentation, instead of having procedures and norms, you have face-to-face informal coordination all the time. This does not work at the organizational level. You need some rules, guidelines, and systems in order to ensure that these different units work well together. If you're interested in this topic, I have a blog with more than 100 articles on organization design, where you can explore this and other organization design topics in more detail. Thank you for your attention.